another session of our Wednesday talks, weekly Wednesday talks. Today we are hosting a young and brilliant scholar, Dr. Sohaib Saeed, on a very important issue on Islamic exegesis, the exegesis of Quran and its translation. Let me briefly introduce you Dr. Sohaib Saeed. After undergraduate studies at the University of Edinburgh and the Faculty of Theology at Al-Azhar, Cairo, Dr. Sohaib Saeed took his PhD at SOAS with a thesis on intra-Quranic hermeneutics. He is an affiliate teacher at the University of Glasgow and a senior researcher for Bayyineh Institute, United States. He has translated classical works from Arabic, including the first volume of the great exegesis of Fakhreddin Razi, published recently, and you can see the first volume here, and which will be the topic of today's talk as well. And he is presently completing work on Jalaluddin as-Suyuti's Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran through the newly formed Center for Advanced Study of the Quran and its Interpretation. Sohaib is developing a range of book projects along a major online platform for Tafsir and translation. And this talk will be about his translation of Fakhreddin Razi's Exegesis. And please join me to give him a warm welcome.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you for this very warm welcome and for this honor that you have given me by allowing me to be with you and to be also in this very historic and very currently important institute, and particularly this building which is so full of history, and also which I know usually we have some very senior scholars and ulama who speak from this platform. So, as you have been made aware, we are speaking today about Tafsir translation and Tafsir authorship, in particular with reference to the translation work which I did over the last couple of years, which has culminated in this volume of the great exegesis by Imam Razi. And when talking about it, I want us to look ahead and have some thoughts about the future of Tafsir translation and the future of Tafsir authorship. Now, of course, in making this title for the talk, I am assuming that we can agree that there should be a future for Tafsir. And this is a point which deserves some thought and reflection and elaboration, which we don't have time for today. But if we assume that Tafsir, as explanation of the Quran, clarification of its meanings, elaboration upon its message and its guidance, that if we assume that this is something which will continue to be a need time after time, and if we assume that there will be a need for people to be involved in this process, in this discipline, in this science, if we're happy to call ilm al-tafsir a science among the sciences, then we need to think together about how we enable that, not just as individuals but as institutions. So that's some backdrop to what I'm going to say. But for now, as was mentioned, one of the first pieces of translation work that I did was actually from Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, the second volume of 4 volumes of Jalaluddin as-Suyuti's Compendium on Quranic Sciences. And that particular volume is very much involved in linguistic issues in the Quran. So when undertaking that work, which was commissioned by a center in Qatar, I encountered numerous things that I felt as a translator, what am I doing here? How am I interfering with an Arabic discussion as a translator and trying to make it intelligible to an English-speaking reader? And I'm going to show you an example of this problem in due course, inshallah. And then, of course, we have this volume of Al-Razi, and I don't know if some of you may be aware, but there is some good news which I have from last week, just before arriving in Istanbul. I was in Doha for a prize-giving ceremony as part of the Sheikh Hamad Award for translation and international understanding. And this book, bifadlillah, received the 3rd place in the category of Arabic to English translation. So this is a very encouraging piece of feedback or response that I received, and gives me some encouragement to carry on with the rest of the work. Now, many of you are going to ask me, are you planning to translate the whole of Tafsir al-Kabir or Mafatih al-Ghaib? You may be aware that this volume 1 is one of 32, and it took about 2 years of solid work, so 64 years is the projection, and if I work extra fast, then maybe 30 years. I personally don't have the plan to continue solely on exerting my effort in translating Tafsir al-Razi, but once we see what happens with the 2nd volume, we can decide how important it is to continue on this particular project. The 2nd volume is going to be not volume 2 from Tafsir al-Kabir. The 2nd volume is going to be a collection of 5 surahs, namely Surah Yousuf, Al-Kahf, Al-Naml, Yasin, and Al-Mulk. So those were chosen for me by the project coordinators, which is the Royal Al-Bayt Institute in Jordan. And I believe they selected this because they felt that these are the surahs that people would be most interested to pick up and to read about. And as a translator, I've also shifted my approach in the 2nd volume, whereas in the first one I was very conscious about the academic readership and scholarship and trying to impress people in the universities, and with very technical language and with detailed footnotes and references. In volume 2, I want to think more about the other audience, which is mainly the Muslim or any person who is seeking after an understanding of the meanings of the Quran. And of course, volume 1 is a very special one, where he talks about the Fatiha. But of course, there's a famous, very famous thing that people have said about Imam Razi's Tafsir, where they said, فِيهِ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ إِلَّا التَّفْسِير. It contains everything except Tafsir. And there was a rejoinder to that, of course, which is فِيهِ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ مَعَ التَّفْسِير. It contains everything along with Tafsir. And that's if we define Tafsir in a fairly narrow way or restricted way. We could be more generous to Imam Razi, and we could say, as a mufassir, everything that he decides should be in the book is Tafsir. فِيهِ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ هُوَ تَفْسِير. Everything that is Tafsir is in here. But however we define it, the fact is that in volume 1 you have 3 kitabs. Okay, Al-Kitab al-Awwal, the first book, i.e. the first third of this volume, concerns the isti'adha, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. But in reality, he is spending a lot of time on his linguistic introductions to his whole project. Then you have the 2nd kitab, which is about the basmala, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. But here he spends a lot of his time giving the theological introductions about names and attributes of Almighty God. Then you come to the 3rd book, which is on the Fatiha, and after a few introductions, including one lengthy chapter which is about juristic issues of Shafi'i fiqh, compared with comparison with other opinions, then he comes to what we can call the Tafsir proper. So in reality, you have to get through this much of the book before you come to what is most recognizable as Tafsir, where he's now going verse by verse and addressing the fawaid and so on under each ayah. And then there is a final chapter, which I have actually redesignated as a chapter. Originally it's another section, which is his commentary on the surah as a whole, where he now does some broader reflections on the whole of the Fatiha and its connection with other parts of the Quran and other things as well. So, coming back to our core issue about the nature of tafsir and translation, this is another point which we could spend more time reflecting on, but I just want to put the question into our mind. Is translation itself a type of tafsir? Right? Can we understand the process of translation as a kind of explanatory process which has some things in common with what tafsir is. When a person is translating the Quran, are they doing tafsir of the Quran? Is the translator of the Quran supposed to have that level of qualification of a mufassir, whatever we might think that the qualification of a mufassir should be? Or does the translator of the Quran depend upon tafasir, depend upon the sources which exist in our Islamic tradition? And then, should we bother translating tafsir? Do we need tafsir in English? And of course, you'll excuse me, I'm going to refer a lot to translation to English. I'm aware that actually Turkish translation is far more advanced than English translation. I'm going to give you a snapshot of where we are with English translations of tafsir. But as you already have the whole Mafatih al-Ghaib in Turkish. And unfortunately, I'm not able to read Turkish and to benefit from that or to give any comment about it except to say, Subhanallah, you did it, right? So, there are a couple of perspectives in the next slide. There's a couple of perspectives on whether it's worth translating the Quran or whether it's better to translate tafsir. So this is a quotation from Marmaduke Pickthall. Of course, you will all have heard, one of the most famous translators of the Quran. And he describes how when he went to Cairo to get the blessing for his translation, he says, I was solemnly advised to give up my nefarious work and translate instead of all imaginable substitutes the commentary of At-Tabari. So they told him, instead of translating the Quran, you should translate tafsir. And you should translate At-Tabari. By the way, some of At-Tabari has been translated by a few different people, including within the same series, there is a number of selections that were translated by Scott Lucas. Pickthall goes on to say, the commentary of Tabari is of enormous bulk and would besides require another commentary of equal length to make its methods and mentality intelligible to English people who had never studied a Quran commentary. So this is what I'm calling a pro-Quran, pro-translation of the Quran rather than pro-translation of tafsir. But then we have Scott Lucas, who has written a paper a while back where he says, it appears that the Anglophone world would benefit far more from the partial or complete translation of Quranic commentaries than it would from yet another translation of the Quran itself. At the very least, a moratorium on translations of the entire Quran for the next decade or two should allow some time for the neglected tafsir literature to receive the attention it deserves. So as I told you, he is the translator of At-Tabari in our series. So let's think about why it is worth translating tafsir. What would be the motivation for that? Could it be that tafsir is more authoritative? We have great names behind these tafasir, whether Al-Fakhr Razi, or whether you come into the Ottoman period and you have in the later part of it Shihab al-Alusi, or you have in the 20th century scholars like At-Tahir ibn Ashur, names which are so big and so grand that we invest them with the authority to speak about the Quran. Whereas if you look at the names of translators, you might say, this is a translation of the Quran. On what basis has this person decided that they are qualified to actually describe the meanings of the Quran through translation? So tafsir could be seen as more authoritative, arguably. By translating tafsir, we can make available to people the reasoning that underlies the meanings beyond the surface. Okay? So translation can only give you a certain amount of the meaning, but then there are things behind that. What is this word referring to? When it refers to certain categories of people, who are they? What was their context? What should be understood behind the surface of the words? And usually, in translations of the Quran, we would be lucky to get a few footnotes. Only someone like Yousuf Ali, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, or Muhammad Asad made a bit more effort to give us more in terms of footnotes and explanation about their own reasoning in translating as they did, and also things that you need to know beyond the surface. Another thing is that tafsir allows you to see the variety inherent in the understanding and interpretation of the Quranic text. A translator, just by by sheer brute of force, when they sit down to write in a book format, has to choose between a number of different interpretations of each word. The vocabulary can give rise to various meanings. There can be different grammar and sentence structure. Where does the sentence start? Where does it end? Do we do the waqf here and ibtida here, and so on? The pronouns, does this huwa refer back to this part of the sentence or to this part of the sentence? فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ. So the shaitan made him forget the mention of his Lord in Surah Yousuf. Who was made to forget, and which Lord is being referred to? All of these there are so many discussions amongst the exegetes and mufassirin about these questions. And even the multiple qira'at are mentioned in the books of tafsir, but it would be very difficult to see them make their way into the books of translation. If it can be done, it requires a lot more thought about how it could be done. So all of this variety is available to any reader of tafsir. But a reader of translation does not have access to that variety, unless they pick up multiple translations and do a comparison. But when they do that, it is a very chaotic process, because they would not know whether this variety is just variety of style, whether this variety, in fact, sometimes you find that there are opinions mentioned in the tafsir as a very decent and strong opinion, and none of the translators chose to adopt it, because they all felt that the other meaning was easier for translation, or they copied each other, or whatever. But the point is, the translators are not telling us everything that the mufassirin are saying. And I think it is important to appreciate that variety. And that is part of, as well, building up in people's mind an appreciation for the fact that the Quran contains multiplicity, multiple possibilities, which can be because as human beings we're not able to determine the definite meaning intended by Almighty God in all cases. But also it could be that God Almighty has intended for multiple meanings to be understood, and that those multiple meanings are correct. So some of the mufassirin are very comfortable with this idea, like Ibn Ashur, rahmatullah alayh. Talking about the state of play just very briefly, our current list of Tafsir translated into English, we have two versions of the Jalalain, and they came out around the same year. The Jalalain, of course, is a very concise, as some have called it, a madrasa exegesis. Honestly speaking, I don't understand why you would translate the Jalalain. The Jalalain is giving you sometimes a very terse grammatical explanation, and translating that grammatical explanation gives nothing to the English reader to understand what is the meaning. But it was done twice in the same year. There are various versions and abridgments of Ibn Kathir, and I've added here that, as I'm aware, Ibn Juzay's Tafsir has also been translated and is currently being prepared for publication. There are parts of Tafsir al-Tabari, parts of Razi, which is us, parts of Al-Qurtubi, the first volume, and also Al-Baydawi. There are various parts, including the beginning, which was done by Jibril Haddad, and actually won from the same award, I think 1 year ago, or maybe 2 years ago. So we're following in some excitement about tafsir translation in Qatar at least. We have various esoteric commentaries, spiritual, Ishari or Sufi commentaries, such as Al-Tustari, Al-Qushayri. There are various modern commentaries which were translated in full, such as by Maududi and Qutb, and also others like Mufti Shafi. Tafsir al-Sa'di has also been translated in full. Then you have some kind of collections and compilations or syntheses, like Mahmoud Ayub has got the Quran and its interpreters, which he's done up until the end of Ali Imran. And we have the Study Quran. The Study Quran could be a big discussion as well. Study Quran is a recent publication which has aimed at giving a synthesis of what's going on across the whole of the commentary tradition, crossing the boundaries of Sunni and Shia, and also influenced, of course, by a certain pluralistic approach to tackling certain verses of the Quran when it comes to the question of salvation and the question of validity of earlier religious dispensations. So while it has been received with a lot of enthusiasm, it has also received a certain amount of criticism, in particular from Sunni Muslims. Then we have books of thematic selections, Helmut Gatje and Hamza and Rizvi and others. There's a series from the Institute of Ismaili Studies and Oxford University, where they are taking a thematic discussion and selecting passages from various tafsir, so that we can read directly what the Mufassirin are saying, but within a broader conversation around certain verses, around certain themes. So this is what's been going on in the world of English translation of tafsir. And maybe you can fill me in if I'm missing something important about translation into Turkish. There may be other things which don't fit these categories. So we have some practical problems which underlie the commissioning of these projects. So I'll speak about these with connection to the tafsir of Imam Razi. First of all, who selects the projects? In this case, the selection is by the Royal Ahl-Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought. We have Prince Razi, who is the main figure behind this. And obviously, any choice of project fits within a broader intent, a broader aim, a broader project, a broader approach, which is being carved out. And the reasoning behind that could be all sorts of things. So I don't know, because I haven't asked him about what is the reasoning behind Tafsir al-Razi, but I feel that a valid reason for choosing Tafsir al-Razi is because Imam Razi himself is demonstrating a way of reflecting upon the Quran very creatively. And I think that that's something that's sort of missing in some of the tafsirs that were available already, like Tafsir ibn Kathir, where there's a more hadith-based approach, a more direct and sort of constrained approach to explaining the ayahs. Whereas Imam Razi will say, under each ayah, وَفِي هَذِي الْآيَةِ مَسَائِل, there are various inquiries here. And then those inquiries can be based upon linguistic questions, or theological questions, or philosophical questions, or cosmological questions, or juristic questions. He will go in many directions, and he will ask the questions. And usually he will be generous enough to answer them for us. But as you know, sometimes those questions, they said, that he pays up front with the with the problem and the doubt, but then he delays the payment with the answer. So who selects the projects? The size of the projects and the cost of the project is another major factor. So to employ someone like me to work on Tafsir al-Razi, you got to prepare to pay for 32 volumes if you want the whole thing done, and the cost of that is going to mount. I'll accept a very small amount for the first volume. After that, I'll say, look, I did a good job. Right? So the cost is a very significant factor. Even if you employ a team of people to do it, it's going to take time. With a team, you can reduce the time, but it's a big factor. Critical editions. Okay, my main complaint and why I'm so upset with the Arab world, they did not do a tahqiq of this book. We don't have a tahqiq of Tafsir al-Razi. And it's baffling why it has not been done. All the editions that we have in the market, they're actually identical to each other, because copy, paste. And the only differences could be how attractive it is on the outside, or how the layout and the type. And one of the editions, the one that I used the most, which is Dar al-Hadith Cairo, they have some hadith comments. Not all the hadiths are given takhrij. Some of them are. So this is a big problem. And as a translator, it should not be my job to go and compare manuscripts. But I'm doing it. I did it a little bit for volume 1, and I'm doing it much more now for volume 2, where whenever I find something as I'm translating it that this doesn't make sense, there's a word out of place here, there's something feels disjointed, something doesn't make sense, then I go to the manuscripts and I try to find whether there is an alternative. A translator should not be burdened with this, Translators should just be relaxed. Take the text as it is. The work of reading the text carefully enough to lay it out should have been done. Instead, I have to worry about manuscripts. I have to worry about where the sentence starts and ends, where the paragraph starts and ends. When he says, الوجه الأول والوجه الثاني والوجه الثالث, and under الوجه الثالث فيه وجوه أول ثاني ثالث. So he'll break a list into lists and sub-lists, and I have to do all the work of figuring out where this list begins, where that list ends. And again, it should not be my job. Someone should have done that. So please, if you know anybody, yeah. But again, size, cost. One time I asked somebody I knew in Cairo who worked on the Dar es-Salaam publication of At-Tabari. So he's one of the muhaqqiqs of that. I asked him about, is there any edition of Razi? He said, La wallahi sa'b. He just said, no, it's too difficult. Which is not an excuse. Okay, the fourth thing, specialist translators and commentators. Now, of course, translation is itself an art. Translation itself is more than just knowing the two languages. Okay, I myself, I'm not trained in translation. I could be called an amateur or a self-taught translator. I hope I'm doing okay. But the point is, there are people who specialize in that field. But at the same time, what I think is perhaps even more crucial, but also very often missing, is that someone who's going to translate a text like this has to understand the text that they're reading. It seems a very obvious point, but somehow people excuse themselves to translate things that they don't understand. And it should be obvious that if you translate something you don't understand, your translation will be wrong. 100% it will be wrong. Because you've taken something, you've just tried to transport some words into other words without mediating by the meaning, without grasping the overall meaning of the sentence, the overall meaning of the paragraph, the overall meaning of the page. If you don't understand that, you cannot translate correctly. Even Google can't do it. And I use Google a lot, not for the translate. I use the dictionaries a lot. There's many words that I don't understand, but what I do understand is what Imam Razi is talking about. Yeah, because you have to know something about Tafsir. Of course, with Imam Razi, you have to know something about all the different sciences that he touches on, and therefore it was very challenging. I don't claim expertise in these fields, but alhamdulillah, having been at Al-Azhar, we at least have some training in all these different disciplines, so we're familiar with technical terminology. When he mentions dawr or khulf, it's not the first time I heard that word. So dawr is Arabic terminologies are deceptively simple. It just could be 3 letters. In English, you get a big long word, and you say, "Oh, that's a very intimidating word," But dawr, but it could be infinite regression. Very simple in Arabic, deceptively simple. So unless you have enough background and familiarity with these things, you would not even notice that he's said something complicated and something which requires a technical expertise. Okay, talking about more problems, we have the academic problems. The academic problems I've touched on to some extent here and there. What is the purpose of translating it? Who's going to read it? This is very important. It's very important to understand who am I thinking about? I have to think about my readership. As I said, if you are thinking about the academic readership, that will have certain implications. And if you're thinking about your brother and sister, mother, father, sitting in their home and trying to read this, you have to do it in a different way. Another academic problem, the breadth of the genre. Tafsir, as we said, فِي كُلُّ شَيْءٍ هُوَ تَفْسِير, right? Tafsir itself seems to gather lots of different things. So that's another difficulty, as I said, if you're trying to be a specialist in this field. A third problem is the focus on language. So much of tafsir is about language. It's Arabic explanation in Arabic terms, using synonyms, using glosses. How do you deal with that? Do you translate it directly? In which case it's incomprehensible, like the Jalalain translations. Or do you or do you consider this to be superfluous? Maybe we should not translate it at all, but we should do something else. When we come to those parts, should we maybe skip over them because it just doesn't work? And fourthly, another issue is that there are sometimes, Imam Razi himself will explain things in a certain way. Now, I need to translate the ayah according to what he thinks it means. I can't just paste in somebody's Quran translation and then it contradicts his explanation. So we have to tailor the Quran translation. Let me give you some practical example here, which is from Al-Itqan, chapter 36, which is fi Gharib al-Quran. So he says, for example, in the narrations from Ibn Abbas, that yu'minun, in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 6, means yusaddiqun. Nansakh means nubaddil. Shatr means nahu. Junah means haraj. Janaf means ithm. Now what do you do? This is what I did. And I think it makes sense. But it's a basic question. This is an Arabic discussion of synonymy. Is ithm really a synonym of junah? Or it's an approximation? That's itself a question which the linguists discuss. But for me, what do I do as a translator? What I did is I translate the explanatory word. I'm not trying to translate the original word. I'm not going to say yu'minun, believe, means yusaddiqun, believe. Or yu'minun, believe, means yusaddiqun, affirm. Because that would be just pretending to translate two different words. Because the claim here is that these are synonyms. So I have to give one translation. So it's strange. But anyway, inshallah, when it comes out in publication, this one is on pause at the moment. We'll see if it comes out in a few years, inshallah. Next slide, please. So here is an explanation from Al-Itqan of the meaning of وَإِنْ كَانَ رَجُلُ يُورَثُ كَلَالَةً. And here I have, because it was my job, I have translated his grammatical explanation. It has been said that its grammatical explanation is i'rab. Depends on the meaning intended by that word. What is the meaning of kalala? Gives rise to different a'arib, different ways of understanding the syntax. For if it refers to the deceased, then it may be an accusative circumstance, hal. And the preceding clause, yurathu, is a predicate of kana, if deficient, naqisa. Alternatively, that clause may be adjectival, sifa, if kana is complete, tamma. It may also be that kana is deficient and kalalatan is its predicate. However, if kalala refers to the heirs, then an annexing noun, mudaf, is taken as implied, i.e. dha kalalatin. And this can be either circumstance, hal, or predicate, khabar, as previously described. If, however, it is taken to mean family relation, then it is an accusative of purpose, maf'ul li ajlihi. Anyone understand anything here? You can't make sense of it because it's an Arabic grammatical discussion. And even people who are very familiar with Arabic grammar cannot make sense of this, especially once it's translated. It's worse than it ever was. I've made it better in some ways. When I've added square brackets, the preceding clause, or if deficient, naqisa, that's actually an improvement, I think, on Imam Suyuti's explanation, because I'm making clearer how the points are diverging. But let me show you what I put in the footnote. In the footnote, I said, these are the 8 things that have sprung out from this explanation. If it's this, then this, and this, and this, and if this, then it could be this or this. It gives 8 different possibilities. The first 3 are on the first meaning of kalala, one who has neither parents nor children. The second 3 means that the kalala refers to the heirs, excluding parents or children. The last 2 is whether, if kalala refers to the extended relations. Then it gives rise to these different translations. This is not what they ask us to do as translators, but I believe we have to be creative about how we take the grammatical material and transform it into something which is intelligible to the English reader. But according to the norms of translating a classical text, I have to put this in the footnote and not in the main part of the text. And bear in mind that this is the fadl and the virtue of translation, which wouldn't have been available to Imam Suyuti when talking in Arabic. Within the same language, he can't do that. He has to do what we saw on the previous slide, explain the grammar. As a translator, I can use a different kind of process to make the meaning clear. I hope that you get the idea, because this is crucial for what I'm going to say about the future. We only have, about 7 minutes. Okay, next slide, please. This is an example from Tafsir Razi, volume 2. From Surah Yousuf. قالوا يا أبانا ما نبغي ما نبغي. Very simple. They have found the money has been returned to them in their sacks, and they say to their father, the brothers of Yousuf alayhi salam say to Yaqub alayhi salam, ما نبغي. So Imam Razi explains it, that it could be for negation, ما نافية, or it could be ما استفهامية, which is B. But under ma nafiya, there are also 2 possibilities. Actually, he mentions 3 possibilities, but I removed one for brevity. For now, it's in the book. So, look here in the square bracket. We are not exaggerating. This is my interference. Because if I just translated the rest of they had described Joseph's generosity and kindness, saying, we came to a man as generous as can be. He gave us lodgings at a level of da 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 da. They were denying that their description was exaggerated or contained anything other than truth. I've taken you straight to that point by saying the corresponding translation of the Quran of ma nabghi, according to the explanation, is we are not exaggerating. Ma nabghi. We want for nothing. Ma nabghi. We don't want anything. We don't need anything. So that's 2 different meanings of nabghi. Bagha, to want something, or bagha, to transgress. In this case, exaggerate. Or it's interrogative, they're saying, what more could we want? Ma nabghi. What could we want beside this? Right. Reflections on this. I'll pass over some of this. I think that you can see some of the issues, right? We're going to have sometimes, the Mufassir is going to use a certain ayah as a dalil. If I just copy and paste the translation from one of the translators of the Quran, that translation may not do the job that he wanted the ayah to do. Do you understand what I mean? You may need a particular translation of the verse in order for it to work as a dalil. And that's something that you have to pay attention to. Terminology, jargon, we talked about this before, dawr and khulf and things like this. Filling gaps. I can't remember what I meant by this. And which parts are useful to the English reader? We've raised this point. Let me tell you about the next project that I'm developing. And this is exclusive. I've never talked about this before. Right? I'm calling it just now a smart translation. This is the Ibn Ashur project. I love Tafsir of Ibn Ashur. And actually, it seems that everybody loves him, which is great. Ibn Ashur, the Zaytuna Imam, he passed away 45 years ago this year. So 2023 will be the 50th anniversary of his passing. And I want to get something done for that time, if Allah gives us tawfiq. So here's the idea. When you're looking at the one page of this, I don't want to translate the whole thing. You get the idea. I don't have the patience or the lifespan, Allahu A'lam, to translate the whole of such big works. But instead, we want to make it efficient and effective. How is it going to be effective? Suppose we have on one page 3 sections. The top section is concerned with translation of the Quran. But translation of the Quran according to Ibn Ashur's opinion. Imagine Ibn Ashur is a translator and he's translating into English. Let's say ma nabghi. We asked him, Imamana, Sayyidna, what is the meaning of this? He might explain over several pages and give you a very eloquent, interesting, enriching Arabic, grammatical, rhetorical, balaghi, nazmi explanation. But it just doesn't carry into translation. So what we must do, we read that. Nastaw'ib. We just absorb what he has said and then we produce the corresponding translations. Because bear in mind, he is telling you multiple possibilities. And we want to reflect that. I'm arguing, we want to reflect for people that the Quran can be read in multiple ways, valid, correct ways. And Ibn Ashur believes that, so I have to follow him in that if I'm working on his tafsir. So, translate the Quran variously according to opinions advanced in the linguistic discussion as though the mufassir were the translator. Right? I'm not aware that it's been done on any scale. Secondly, non-linguistic things can go in the second part of the page. All the other things that he says, his opinions, his explanations that are non-linguistic, can be summarized, because there would be no need to translate in full, but just to keep it concise so that it's manageable. And thirdly, to add discussion and references in the lower level, where as editors, as people involved with it, we might have a comment, something to add, but we should not interfere with the space of the original author that we are commenting on. And that was one of the issues with the study Quran. One of my issues with it is the sense of editorial involvement is very intermingled with the presentation of traditional and classical opinions. And it can be sometimes difficult. Unless you are a very keen-eyed reader, I think a common reader could get very confused between what they are quoting from the classical sources and what is their own personal opinion. So I want to say my personal opinion, but I want to put it at the bottom of the page so that you can ignore it if you want. Okay. Final point. A final point is that we need to go beyond the limits of the book format. We love books. I know we all love books. They will continue, inshallah, until the end of time. But the world is moving fast. And we need to think about digital platforms and digital formats. And we need to think about how, not just to make PDFs of the book, so that you can read a book, but on a digital device, but we need to think about how our digital tools can enable us to reconfigure the materials that go into tafsir. Whether tafsirs that already exist, how we can reconfigure. I had another paper which I delivered at the ACI conference a few days ago, which was called The Digital Mufassir. Right? And it was, because it was about Ottoman tafsir, so the subtitle was Reimagining the Tafsir of Al-Alusi for a New Era. So don't worry, I did talk about Al-Alusi and the Ottoman tafsir, but I wanted to be forward-looking about it. How could we take a master work like Ruh al-Ma'ani of Al-Alusi, which contains, فيه كل شيء هو تفسير, it contains everything that you'd want. How do we reconfigure those materials into digital platforms? So inshallah, if any, you can one day read my paper about that. But the idea here is making use of new technologies for thinking about authorship as well. If we're compiling new works of tafsir, can we think about doing it in a way which is not just the same way that they had to do before these tools were available? The question-centric approach you can read about in my paper. Collaboration and democratization. Now, communications allow us to work together across the entire globe, and how we can get people involved. They can read and they can ask questions. They can ask questions about the Quran, they can ask questions about the tafsir, and experts can engage with that. There are so many possibilities, and I just want to put this as a way of looking ahead and thinking forward. And alhamdulillah, I'm pleased to be here and to we have some copies of the book if anyone's interested, and I'm very interested in your questions and feedback and comments, inshallah. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.